evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name's Jenny Niven. I'm the Associate Director here at the Wheeler Centre. It's lovely to have you all out so close to the beginning of our programme. We just started on Tuesday night, so we're back full swing now from here until December. Thank you for coming and supporting us. This is a very special evening, I think. It's a chance to explore a really quite unique book, one which I think, given its reach, particularly among a literary savvy crowd internationally, well, I think have a real impact on the way that Indigenous fiction is looked at from Australia. So you're in a very privileged position, being able to hear firsthand from all the folks who were involved in its creation, except for Tara June Wynn. She's not here this evening. She lives in Paris, so she didn't come. So this evening we've got with us Jordan Bass on the far right. He's the managing editor of the American literary magazine McSweeney's and the quarterly journals that you see. On my right is Chris Flynn. He's a novelist, an essayist, an editor, general literary man about town, and he selected the stories for this collection and writes a preface for them in the book. On my right here, wait, is that my? That's your left. My left. Thank you, Chris. This bodes well, doesn't it? This is Ellen van Neerven-Currie. She's a newer voice in Australia's literary scene, but one we're set no doubt to hear more of in the future. She's a writer of short stories, and she works at the Black and Write project at the State Library of Queensland. Beside Ellen is Tony Birch. He's a novelist and teacher of creative writing. Most recently, he wrote the novel Blood, which was shortlisted for, and I personally think should have won, the Miles Franklin Award. And on the far left is Melissa Lucashenko, who's the author of four or five novels, Melissa?
I've written 5, the 5th is about to be published.
Right. Yeah. That's Mullumbimby, right? That's coming out shortly. She's also an essayist and short story writer, and is, I believe, on the Australia Council Board for the Indigenous Arts. Is that right? Yeah. Right. Please join me in welcoming all of our contributors. Because it's quite a big panel, we're going to divide the evening a little bit into two sections. So first, I'll have a chat to Jordan and Chris about where the sort of genesis for the book came from, how the collection came together, how it all sits, and then we'll talk to the writers themselves about the stories in a bit more detail, and they'll maybe read a little bit. We'll have a bit of an exploration of the actual content, and then talk more generally about the whole process of the stories being anthologised. So, do you want to start us off, Jordan? Can you introduce McSweeney's and this particular collection?
Sure. So, McSweeney's is a small press and also a quarterly journal based out of San Francisco. Started in 1998 by the novelist Dave Eggers, and we're up to our 41st issue now. So it hasn't been exactly quarterly, a little erratic over the last 14, 15 years. And this one includes this section on Indigenous Australian writing that Chris Flynn helped us put together. We always try to sort of think of the journal as just pulling from every source we can and just mixing things together based purely on what's most exciting to us at the time. But I think over the last couple of years we've been trying to walk the walk a little bit with that too, and look a little more actively in unexpected places.
So how do you mean? So previously the stories would have come to you, but now you're more actively seeking them? Or what do you mean by walking the walk?
Yeah, that is pretty much what I mean. So we really commission very little material relative to other magazines. We don't even really solicit writers that often. We kind of just wait for stuff to pile up and then build our issue out of that. Which I think feels really free and spontaneous and interesting to me most of the time. But you get a sense of sort of patterns and limitations just in that body of work that's sort of naturally coming to your door. So with projects like this, I think it's us trying to push on the boundaries of what would be included in the magazine.
Right. It's kind of testament to the extraordinary profile and impact of McSweeney's that you're in a position to do that in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we're very lucky to have people just bring sort of world-class work to us a lot of the time, and just be excited about that collaboration.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you look for in the stories across the board, not just this collection, but generally?
I think we're looking for stories that can over-deliver for a reader, that can accomplish a lot very quickly and very creatively, and be serious and funny and vivid and somehow ambitious or experimental at the same time, rather than a story that maybe is just good in one way or is even really good in one way, but maybe misses on the edges of that. We try to find things that, I think we try to find things that deliver that whole mix. Yeah.
And what about you, Chris? How did you get into the McSweeney's mix?
It's kind of through serendipity, really. I was always a McSweeney's subscriber from really early days of the journal, and I've got a whole shelf dedicated on my bookshelf. It's actually 2 shelves now. It's got, since the recent issues have been very large physically, and so I was always an admirer of the journal and didn't really know anything, didn't know anybody who worked there or anything like that for a long time. And then in recent years I noticed that McSweeney's had been doing exactly what Jordan says. They had been branching out into and looking at what other countries are doing in fiction, which was quite interesting for an American journal to be looking to see. Like, there was a suite of writing by Icelandic writers, which was kind of born, I think, out of the fact that the journal was originally printed in Iceland. Is that right?
Yeah, the first few issues, Dave, back in the day, had found this Icelandic art book printer called Odie. That he really loved.
Right.
Yeah. So we did a run with them before it got really expensive, and then we went back there more recently when the Icelandic economy collapsed. Became more affordable again. But yeah, that first collection was inspired. McSweeney's had this early affinity for Iceland, and that was way back in issue 15.
Yeah, and then there was a couple of other issues after that in more recent times. There was a suite of stories by Kenyan writers, and then the suite of stories by Norwegian writers. And so I thought, it's obviously something that they're doing. They're looking at different parts of the world to see what's going on, a little snapshot of writers in those territories.
Can I just ask you, Jordan, though, about those countries, because they preceded this one, what made you, aside from Iceland, what made you choose Kenya and then Norway? How did those come around?
I think in both of those cases it actually was meeting people who could sort of open a door for us into those places. So in a way we haven't changed our approach too much, and that we're still kind of waiting for someone to show up and say, hey, I know a lot about Kenyan fiction and I'm really excited about it. I can tell you what's over there. So that was a writer named Binyavanga Wainaina helped us with the Kenyan section, and editor in Norway, John Eric Riley, helped us over there.
So then you showed up, Chris, right?
Well, I showed up because I had gotten to know Jordan's predecessor, Eli Horowitz, at McSweeney's a number of years ago and become good friends with him, and had a bit of a connection with McSweeney's over the years. And parallel to this, because I've been in Australia about 12 years, I had come here and gone to a lot of writers' festivals, both as just an audience member and then later on as a chair of events, and then later on as a guest, and met a lot of Indigenous writers who it was all new to me, right? I was just here from Ireland about 10 years ago, and so I was getting exposed to fiction that I'd never read before, and in the back of my mind I was thinking, a lot of what Indigenous writers are doing, particularly in the short form, seems to be very much in tune with the kind of fiction that McSweeney's are printing. It'd be nice if someone could one day put these two together. And it wasn't until years later where I suddenly almost had this miniature epiphany where I thought, I think it's going to have to be me who does this, because no one else seems to be doing it. And I was in America last year, and I was staying in Eli's house around the corner from the McSweeney's office, and I just went round to see Jordan and said, there's a lot of Indigenous writers in Australia doing really exciting things at the moment. Maybe it's time to put together a bit of a suite of Indigenous writing, and would you guys be interested in doing that? And it was just as simple as that, really. And Jordan just said, well, go and collect some submissions and we'll see what comes through. And that was just over a year ago, and now all of a sudden we have this fabulous issue with all these great writers in it. So I was just acted as a conduit, really. I was happy to be the odd middleman to put these people together, and here it is.
So how did you go? What was the process then for receiving the submissions, and how did you collect them, and how did you select them, and how did you guys work together to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it was all pretty straightforward. As soon as I came back from America last August, I just put out a call for submissions and said, this is a possible thing that might happen. And I knew a lot of the Indigenous writers anyway, so I contacted a lot of people personally and said, hey, if you've got any stories, send them through. We're going to put some submissions into McSweeney's, see if they like them. And that was it, really. I just collected submissions over a number of months and made a bit of a selection and sent them off to these guys, and then they made their own selection from those, and this was it. So it all just happened quite organically and quite sort of naturally. It just seemed to be, obviously, the stars aligned or something. It was just time for that. Yeah.
And were there things that jumped out at you at the... well, firstly, what was the criteria for you for selecting the stories? Did you think that you wanted stories that were representative of Indigenous life in Australia? Like, how do you go about that, or was it just purely a mark of quality?
Oh, not really. I mean, I'm not really an expert on those things. I mean, I've been an editor for years, and I probably have quite esoteric tastes when it comes to stories. I'm notoriously difficult to please, I think. So the stories that I liked were stories that just seemed to be, maybe I unconsciously had that same ethos as McSweeney's anyway, that sort of looking for things that were quite ambitious and experimental, willing to play with language, willing to step outside some boundaries and take risks, the kind of stories that really got me excited when I read them. I mean, to give you an example, when Ellen's submission came in, I literally sort of jumped off my chair and was pumping the air and saying, oh, this is great, this is just the sort of thing I was hoping we might get. So I was very excited about that. And if you have that reaction to a story when you start reading it, then it's got to be good, right? And I was familiar with Tony and Melissa's work from years. I'd been following Melissa in the Griffith Review, where she's published a lot of fiction and non-fiction over the years, so I was hoping to get something good from her, and she actually sent through 2 great stories, and it was a bit of an agonising task choosing which one was the best. And Tony, I have been a really big fan of his. I think he's one of the best short story writers probably in the world at the moment, and his novel just was amazing. Why that didn't win the Miles Franklin is a bit of a scandal, I agree there. But so to me, there was these exciting writers out there doing really exciting work, and it was just about, I guess it was just about excitement, really, just feeling like there was these stories that were really pushing the boundaries, and so I just gathered a bunch of those and sent them off to these guys, and fortunately they sort of shared that enthusiasm.
Yeah, great. Jordan, did you have any sort of preconceived notions about what type of stories you might receive, and were they confirmed or drawn out the window, or what was that process like?
Yeah, I really didn't. I think. I mean, I think that's what we really learned from doing those 2 sections more recently with Norway and Kenya. That it was really surprising in a great way what people were interested in writing about and what kind of stories they were interested in telling. So I sort of went into it with just a total pleasant ignorance of what would come our way. And was really excited to see the kind of writing we did get in, and how invested it was in working with voice and working over the texture of those sentences and the language and the kind of I mean, I was really interested in the kind of stylized approach that these guys were able to take with it.
Were there any big disagreements, any bust-ups between you guys over what should make the cut and what shouldn't?
Well, Chris submitted a 75-page novella of his own that he wanted to
called Growing Up Black in Dublin.
Yeah. It was about Ireland.
I'm Indigenous to Ireland.
Right, I guess. So we're holding on to that one for a future issue. Right?
We'll never see the light of day, damn
it was worth a try.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think once this group of stories came in, the process was really smooth, and working with all these guys, on the edits we did. Was a total breeze.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear it and explore the work in a bit more detail. Melissa, would you like to start us off? Can you just give us do you need a copy? Do you want to give us just a couple of words of introduction to the story first, and then read us a short passage?
Yeah, buy it.
That's your
I guess in a way the story that I ended up having published here, it's called Tonsils, and in a way it's a return to the kind of gritty working class writing that I sort of became known for in Steam Pigs, my first novel. I hope it's interpreted the way it's intended, which is, yes, it's a story of underclass life in Logan City, where I'm currently living, and yes, it's about violence and people with people who are just scratching to make a living, and not to stay alive, but to try and make a life that's worth living, I guess, in a really poor part of Australia. Beneath that, though, it's meant as an allegory of colonisation. Those of you that rush out and buy several copies of McSweeney's after this will learn that the violence in my story appears to be random and brutal, but it's actually a story about Aboriginal law and about responsibilities of people living on their own country to welcome strangers, and what happens when that welcome is abused. I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs where the young white girl is introduced. Sunday afternoon, Bethania. The flat across the road hasn't sold, and the real estate agent has packed up her hopeful black and yellow banner and gone back to where the buyers are. Money's the thing, eh? Hayley says to me, with the intense clarity of being 15 and one short stumble away from homelessness. Mum's up me to pay her phone bill. Well, it's one thing. I don't add that it's not the only thing. We both know that, just like we know how far out in front it is. Money. Winning any old race you might care to mention by a dozen lengths, everything else bringing up the field and dodging the clods of muddy turf flying past in money's wake. Hayley's on the back deck, surrounded by a host of pirated DVDs that she's brought home from her big visit. She's using her fork to scratch graffiti onto my plastic tabletop. 3 pale anarchy symbols appearing simultaneously as the tines plough their way into the desiccated green surface. A for anarchy. A for another bill. A for Aborigine. Hayley knows I don't give jack shit about the table. It's on its last legs like a lot of stuff around here. She's already stencilled her art onto the walls downstairs with a can of black spray paint she found in the garage. I wish she'd asked first, but the pictures are good. Money and tonsils, Hayley nods firmly at her assessment of the situation. She's happy to have a handle on things, to have got things sorted straight in her mind one time.
So in the story, Melissa, we come to there's quite a violent conclusion. There's a physical fight.
Yeah.
It's a really kind of strong image without giving away too many spoilers, although that's kind of inevitable. Yeah. We've got this woman defending her property in the garden. She's standing there, she's kind of on her territory. What's the significance of the relationship between the two women when that's being played out?
Well, Hayley's a white girl. This is partially based on fact. I did take in a young white homeless girl a couple of years ago, and her mother is a drunk, although she never came to my house. The significance is that it's the central character's responsibility as an Aboriginal person in her home, living and practising Aboriginal law in an urban context. The central tenet, in my belief, of Aboriginal law is to protect all life, to nurture all life, And that doesn't matter if you're black or white or pink or purple. If you're an adult, you have responsibilities for what happens in your domain. And therefore, when a homeless white child wanders in, you have responsibilities there just as you would if it was a homeless Aboriginal kid. The problem is not with the girl herself, but with the accusations and the behaviour of the mother, who is seeing her child as having been captured, I suppose, by another family, and a family that's morally suspect at that. The daughter's gay, so is the daughter of the main character. The mother turns up drunk, yelling about her phone bill. Who's going to pay the phone bill? Why are you living with lesbians? All this kind of thing. And the Aboriginal mother is dismissive and, says, don't get your fucking flaps in a knot and go away and sober up. And she doesn't. She pushes and she pushes and she pushes and she pushes until violence actually becomes inevitable. And the point on which it turns is when it stops being an economic issue and the language becomes the language of race, and at that point we reach ignition. And at that point the colonial project is complete and the central character has been forced to become some kind of horrible semblance of the coloniser, to mirror the violence that's been perpetrated upon her.
And it's about ownership of the daughter at heart, isn't it? That sort of battle for...
Yeah, it is in a way. It is in a way, yeah. And, which is, again, yet another expression of the colonial impulse, to control people and to not only property. And I guess the heart of imperialism is about conquest and dispossession, but the heart of colonisation is about transformation, about transforming. It's the Stockholm syndrome writ large and writ even further, so that we as colonised people are encouraged and supposed to, and often do, not only love our coloniser but actually become them. And that's what I'm trying to shine a spotlight on.
And you still want to use that language of a colonised people in the heart of the stories? And
I don't use that language, I use allegory, of course.
Right.
But yeah, totally we're a colonised people. Absolutely we are.
I understand that at the weekend for Radio National up in Brisbane there was a bit of controversial chat. Chris was telling me that you were discussing the relationship of, or basically the role of literature in a convict society. Can you explore that a little more for us?
I wasn't aware that it was controversial. I seem to constantly stumble into controversy without really meaning to.
That's all right.
To me, I forget what the actual question was, but I basically said that, and I've been reflecting on this today in Melbourne as I wander around, because, when you come and speak somewhere, it's a formality to say that you're very pleased to be here and the people that invited you are doing wonderful things. But when I look at the program at the Wheeler Centre and I actually look at the audiences who continue to come to the Wheeler Centre, I think that this is one of those small gems of Australian culture, like Griffith Review, like Radio National, like the Writers' Festivals, where serious ideas actually do get raised and discussed and chewed over. And what I said on the weekend was that Australia, to me, is mainstream Australia is a convict culture. People arrived illiterate, criminal, brutalised, brutal, and with very little in the way of intact cultures of their own. And 224 years later, that's pretty much what I see, except in immigrant populations that bring traditional cultures with them. It's a ghastly culture, mainstream Australian culture, and why people don't actually fall to their knees in gratitude that there is still an Aboriginal culture here to embrace is beyond me.
Did you write the story, Melissa, for this collection, or did you already have that in your...
No, I actually can't remember writing it. It was... Chris... I didn't know who Chris was. I got an email from some random guy called Chris Flynn saying there was some magazine, apparently, called McSweeney's, And did I have anything? And I wrote back and said, "No, sorry, I don't." Because I'm not a short story writer. I'm a novelist and I'm an essayist. And I'm a horse breeder when I've got the money, which I don't at the moment. I'm really not a short story writer. So I said, "No, sorry, mate. Whoever you are, on your way." And he came back. He came back 2 or 3 months later and said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Oh, I've got a couple of things knocking around in the bottom drawer, but they're not much chop. So have a look at them and see what you think." And so I didn't write it for McSweeney's, and I must have written it for my own amusement, I think.
Yeah, but were you... Yeah, I'm just wondering about the process of choosing a story. Like, would you choose a story differently knowing that it's for an international collection than one that's produced in Australia? And are there specific messages that you would like, the issues that you're discussing, that you would be really keen to have raised on an international platform? Or?
I don't think I'd choose a different story, but I was saying in Brisbane the other weekend that the language had to be modified slightly for an international audience, and especially an American audience.
Dialogue, you mean, or...?
A little bit, only marginally, but like in that excerpt that I read, it says A for anarchy, A for another bill, A for Aborigine. And this is internal dialogue of the narrator, and it's in italics. And in the original it said A for Abo, and it's meant to be her reflecting on living in a society where casual racism is just an everyday thing. But in America, Abo isn't known to be an offensive term. To them, it's an acceptable abbreviation. And I've had Americans say Abo to me and not realise that. So it lost its meaning, and therefore I just lengthened it to Aborigine, so I wasn't using a racist term with no benefit. Right. Stuff like that.
We don't have enough time for this discussion. Tony, can we hear a little bit? Do you want to introduce your story first before you read us?
Yeah, I'm happy to. My story came out of a conversation with my publisher, John Hunter, who's here, who's a deeply spiritual man. And John told me about a mad church in Brunswick, a Church of Spiritual Healing, which is a great line from a Bruce Springsteen song, and hence the story's called The Promise, after a Springsteen song. And it was one of those great moments when someone says something, you just know you've got to go. You know there's a story there. So I was convinced before I went that there's an important issue of writing here to deal with. And then I went to the church and it was amazing, and I walked out sort of thinking I'd been blessed with this wonderful material, and I had the idea for the story, and such as the bearded man with these absolutely beautiful breasts, which you'll read about when you read the story, that actually happened, and I fell in love with him immediately. Then though I had the notion of what to do with that idea, and I'm very interested in sort of religious motifs. And I was thinking about notions of the intervention and negative representation of Aboriginal people, but also just the focus on alcohol. And I've written a lot about alcohol, and I think in my fiction I've written about the destructive aspects of alcohol, and how it does lead to violence within and external to all communities. But I actually wanted to write a story about someone who accepted his drinking habits and was quite happy about them at some level, even though the story is quite surreal in some ways. So I wanted to write a story that didn't shy away from the idea that this guy drinks a lot, he gets in a lot of trouble when he drinks, and he happens to be a black fella, and I think that people would probably shy away from that representation. So that was the main motivation. I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs to show you what a great time he's having. At home, I went through the medicine cupboard again and grabbed hold of all the pills I could find. Sleeping tablets, antidepressants, painkillers, a few vitamins. I shoved them all in my gob, stuck my head under the tap and drank until I'd swallowed the lot. Rifling through the refrigerator, I found a lonely can of beer at the bottom of an empty vegetable tray. I drank it, stuck my head in the pantry, came out with half a bottle of vanilla essence and down that as well. Abraham had kept a shotgun all his life. He'd never fired it as far as I knew, but he liked to keep hold of it, claiming that one day he might be called upon to protect the righteous from the sinners, black and white. The gun wasn't hard to find. I crawled under his old double bed, or our bed, and searched around until I found the loose floorboard, then fished around some more until I felt the cold steel of the barrel. I knew the gun was loaded without having to cock it. The breech held a 12-gauge birdshot cartridge for as long as I could remember. I was ready to shoot myself right there in the house. but thinking about the mess it would make, about Carol or somebody else finding me with half my head caked to the ceiling, I stood up and walked out onto the front veranda. It was belting down with rain by then. I looked across at the hills behind the town, at the stand of trees in the distance, and then back at the lonely house. I couldn't abandon it this way, I decided. I went around back of the shed, collected half a can of petrol that I'd kept for the mower, and went back into the house to douse the rooms. The place was fully alight in less than a minute. The dry old boards crackled with pain and weeped off the last traces of paint Abraham had put on them years back. I turned away from the flames and went to the car. Driving out of town, I held the gun between my knees with the barrel scratching at my throat. If it had gone off then and there, I'd have died happy. Would have saved me from testing my courage. Between the belting rain, a dirty windshield, the fuck wiper blades and the pills and grog, I was driving on a prayer. The car wobbled and weaved across the highway, by some miracle dodging trucks and trees and a bit of livestock, cows mostly. I don't know if it was one of them that I hit or one of those ghost trees they talk about around here that appear out of nowhere, but the last thing I remember was headbutting the windshield.
The language in that passage is illustrative of the story as a whole, but I'm sure that's what struck you, Chris, and what you'd mentioned before about just the brutality and the violence of it. And there was one other sentence in the story, not from the selection that you read, which is about the boy when he's really little and his mum abandons him, and you just wrote, she got the wanders. And that's all it takes to have this huge kind of terrible thing that's happened, but there's this just lightness of touch about it. It's phenomenal.
I mean, I'm not naive, but it does surprise me. It doesn't feel like a particularly violent story to me. Maybe it's relative. It doesn't feel like... I feel it's one of the funniest stories that I've written. And, you know, the fact of his mother abandoning him it's not unusual where I come from. Or his dad, or you know, someone else. And I seriously, with stories like this, I love playing with language and I love playing with violence, but sometimes I actually think internally, for me, as writing, it's a little bit cartoonish almost.
Right.
And it's not as gritty or as... people often refer to my writing as bleak. And it doesn't seem to me to be one of the bleakest stories I've written. I do bleaker, much bleaker than that.
Right.
And, I think my first book, Shadowboxing, is still the bleakest book that I've written, and one that I really enjoy. I like to, depress people occasionally. But I found this a very easy story to write, and it's the most enjoyable... This story and a passage in Blood around this blackfellow Magic in Blood, this guy, those two pieces of writing are the most enjoyable pieces of writing I've ever written.
Really?
And when when you're writing badly, but when I finished this first draft, I thought, I really like it.
There's a real forward momentum to the story, a sort of sense of propulsion.
Yeah, well, if you're souped up on the grog and tablets, there's a lot of momentum.
Can you just, when you introduced the story, you mentioned that was a sort of stereotype or a representation of Aboriginal people that people generally shy away from. Can you...
Well, it's not the stereotype, it's actually undermining, not the stereotype, but the pity. So one of the things that I came out of the background of being a historian, and people might find uncomfortable to hear it, but I think the Aboriginal person that most, or mainstream Australia, is most comfortable with is the Aboriginal person in the gutter, the most dispossessed, the most helpless, that can be pitied, can be helped in that most paternalistic of ways. So that what I was more or less thinking about is I actually want to deal with... I don't shy away from the damage of alcohol to any community, and again, it's as prevalent or more prevalent in mainstream Australia than it is in Aboriginal communities.
It's plenty prevalent in Scottish culture as well.
And Irish culture in San Francisco. And it was to say, this guy, he's a bit of a hopeless drunk, but he gets joy out of that. Mm-hmm. Well, there's some, I love it when he drives into the in-laws' farmhouse, knocks down the letterbox and gets out and says, "Here you go,
Ted." Falls out the car,
And there's that lovely scene when because he marries a white girl, and when the wife goes home to tell the family she's marrying a black fellow, the mother says, "He's got land. He has land." That sort of, he's made it. Yeah. And the fact that they see him, when he's on the wagon, he drinks Earl Grey tea and he puts on the suit, and then all that falls apart. I like that because it's saying to that the parents, the pastoralists, yeah, fuck you. I'm not going to be the black fella who can be assimilated and be dutiful.
Right.
I'm going to get back on the piss. My wife's going to leave me. I'm going to knock down your letterbox. I'm going to fall in love with a man with breasts, and I'm going to burn the house down.
Right.
You know, it's a happy ending.
Let's talk about your story, and then we'll have a bit more broad chat together. Do you want to introduce S and J for us a little bit first?
Sure. Well, there's a line in this story that was really an anchor for me when I was writing it, and that line comes from my Dutch auntie, actually. About 5 or 6 years ago, a bunch of my rallies from the Netherlands came to stay with us for a couple of weeks, and so we were deciding what to do. Obviously, go to the coast, go to the zoo, pat some kangaroos and koalas, go to the mountains, and go to Sizzler, because that was a big hit, because apparently they don't have anything like that over there. And anyway, my auntie said, yeah, but I really want to see a real Aboriginal. And me and my mum just burst out laughing at that, because what can you say, really? So that line is in the story, and I'll read the start of it. Jay calls to stop when I'm going full blow down the line, and I press my foot down hard, thinking I nicked a roo. The dust mushrooms up, and at first I can't see anything. When it clears, I see the bird standing in the road, pale and overdressed. Far out, I say. Pop the boot, Jay says. Hold on. You already stopped. She pats the radio as she gets up beside me. And put something else on, will ya? Don't want to think we're all bogans. Jay walks up to the bird, smile on, arms out, and soon the bird's smiling too, giving Jay her backpack and following her to the car. Jay gets in the back seat and the girl does too. Hi, she says, German accent, Sigrid. Hi, Sigrid, I say, I'm Esther. S, she says, S and J. Yeah, I say, starting the car up and veering back onto the road. I'm so glad, Sigrid says, that I finally met a real Aboriginal. Through the top mirror, I see she has a hand on Jay's shoulder. You must tell me everything, Jay. Tell me about your hardship.
So there's three characters really in the story. There's Sigrid, who's the German hitchhiker who we meet, but then there's the two more central characters who are Jay and Esther. And Jay and Esther both have really quite different experiences of their Aboriginal identity, don't they? Do you want to describe the differences between those two characters? And I was struck by how confident Jay is about how she embraces, and people, because she has much darker skin, people instantly identify her as Indigenous, whereas Esther feels quite sort of marginalised because she thinks
Sigrid thinks she's Spanish.
She's Spanish initially.
Yeah. Well, I think I've probably been trying to write a story like this for about 3 years, actually. So I had these two characters in my head pretty well. Jay, who's comes into Esther's life as a bit of a shock for her, because she's I think what I wanted to try and do is show a young woman trying to own her identity, and with Jay clashing, the two characters clashing, I think that comes across.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also the thing that Esther's quite critical of how Jay almost trades in her identity, isn't she? She actually uses it to seduce Sigrid a little bit,
yeah,
doesn't she?
Yeah, very much so.
So The other thing, the other subtext, like the characters of the story are resistant classification in a few different ways, aren't they? The relationship between the two of them is quite complex. Like how are they two connected? And the first time you read the story, you're not quite sure. And then, do they have a sexual relationship? What's the source of the tension between them? Was that important to you to show that the identities are complex in lots of different ways, not just in relation to the Indigenous identity?
Yeah, definitely about relationships. I mean, I've written stories about these two characters before, and I've had people say, "Are they lovers? Are they sisters?" You know, but they're actually friends, and this character Jay is a dominant character in the relationship.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting the way that Sigrid sort of, when she leaves the scene, she leaves she's pushed out in a way, isn't she? She can't handle the tension really between the two of them, and it's really important to Esther as she leaves. She says to her, "You know, I'm Indigenous too. I'm an Aboriginal too." Was that a sort of right of reply? Did you want to tell me about having that character make that statement?
Yeah, that was a moment for me that was what I wanted to say in the story, and I was conscious that I had a real subtle approach to the story and just trying to get the issues and the themes across without it going under the water, basically. And I think the process with Jordan was really good because we mixed up a couple of sections but I still felt that he was really respectful for the voice and the style that I was going with as well.
Do you want to comment on that, Jordan, about how you felt when you first received the story and working with it?
Yeah, I mean, I was really riveted by that relationship and the ambiguity of it and the ambivalence of Esther in that situation.
Can you see Ellen? Am I blocking?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Ellen. Hi. So I think it was just about sort of maintaining that slow rhythm that she's talking about. I mean, it's a very quiet kind of confrontation that you get between these three characters, but it feels really piercing when you read it, I think. So I think we mostly just talked about how to make that come across cleanly and clearly without overplaying it, and I guess a little bit without underplaying it too. You know, trying to make the ending just land in the right way.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in and say that to me this demonstrates how an Aboriginal reader is going to read differently to a white reader generally, because for me, yes, Ellen talks about skin colour, as I think Tony mentions skin colour. I don't think I do in my piece. It's a constant motif, and it will always be a constant motif because of our history. But to me, Ellen's fair-skinned character isn't defensive at all, and to me, I wouldn't have even called it a confrontation. To me, she just states with calm authority at one point, I'm not Spanish, I'm Aboriginal too. That's how I took it. I didn't see it as something that she had to struggle to get to or even struggle to say, in a sense. It was just, this person's ignorant. At first I won't bother correcting them. You know, later on in the piece I'll say what I've got to say and just tell them where they're wrong. I don't know. What do you think, Ellen? How did you...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I mean, I think you described it much better than I could.
I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I think the German girl kind of comes across as a pipsqueak in the story, and I mean, the conflict I was interested in was between S and J, between these title characters, and the way... I think it's interesting the way Sigrid is kind of... She's sort of...
she's like a pawn, isn't she? She's
she's a little bit of interference between them when... I think in a way S is thinking about this trip as a moment of resolution of something between them, and then they run up against this obstacle, I guess, that postpones it.
It's like Ivan Sen's film Beneath Clouds has a visibly Aboriginal character and a fair Aboriginal character, and a lot of the reviews and criticism around that film said, there's an Aboriginal character and there's either a part Aboriginal character or an Aboriginal character searching for her family, but they're both searching. Both those characters are searching, and you know, this is a demonstration of how far mainstream has got to go in understanding even the basics of who we are. You know, even the very fundamentals of what it is to be Aboriginal, which is superficially got a lot to do with skin colour, but really at heart has very little to do with skin colour at all.
What did you think, Melissa, and then all of you, what do you think about the process of being in an anthology like this one, an Aboriginal Australian fiction edition?
As in being classified?
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with it. If I saw an anthology of native Canadian fiction or Native American fiction or Māori fiction or Pacific fiction, I'd grab it and read it as I would, you know, a Kenyan edition, an Icelandic edition. Probably especially an Icelandic edition, because I think Icelandic is the only language in the world that doesn't have any related languages. Is that right? Or am I thinking of Finnish?
Is that right? Well. It's not derived from anything else or got any
It's
relation?
either Icelandic or Finnish. I'm not sure. And so that is a very interesting peculiarity to me.
Actually, we had Sean, an Icelandic writer, in town in May, and he was talking about that and about the literary heritage of Icelandic. It's almost totally
back
pure
to the sagas.
because of that. Yeah.
The other thing, I mean, people don't realise, I've been in the... there's a Etchings, which is a journal in Melbourne, and they do Etchings Indigenous every year, or they've done 2 or 3. And one thing above all others, and this goes for this as well, is that I just take enormous pleasure to be in anything with another group of blackfellas. Regardless of what external labels will be or being categorised, and I know that argument, you know, it's a tired argument, but I understand it. Every time I've been in that and I see the other Aboriginal writers and filmmakers and photographers, I just feel rapt to be in their company. And when you go to the gig, you meet people you know well, other people you've never met, like Melissa, and you just think it's great comradeship. So internally it has that impact.
It's paper corroboree.
It also depends. You've got to negotiate you're negotiating your identity as a blackfelt all the time, and I'm in charge of it. So, when people might think about, Aboriginal rights either being exploited, typecast, put in a box, it doesn't interest me because it's a naive view and it doesn't understand my agency. So for me, to be quite honest, I really trusted Chris. And if someone says to me, do you want to do something? I don't get paranoid about their motivation. My first reaction is, well, what can I do that's valuable to me as a writer, valuable to a reader? So I was totally trustful of Chris. And to be completely blunt, my first reaction was, fuck, McSweeney's. Yeah, Melissa hasn't heard of it. I thought, I'll nug it up to get in this. I'll do anything. And then
I don't think Jordan knows what that means.
Yeah, you're gonna have to explain that to me later.
But the point being, and this is when it all matters, and I know Melissa's writing well, and it's just wonderful to have a new young writer that you haven't experienced before. And this is what people don't get. In the end, when I then say, okay, someone has said to me, we're going to accept your writing or we're going to allow you to submit, it's the same as anything. Then the test is, I'm going to now do the best piece of writing I can because whatever anyone thinks it's in there for, it's in there because someone's giving me space. And as a writer, if someone says, here's 8 pages to write a story, I would never say no unless it was I had a political difference and think, well, I can do something, I want to produce the best story I can because I want to share it with a reader, like any other writer.
Yeah, sure.
So, and that becomes the bottom line, because I have seen instances where people ask blackfellas to do stuff and they don't even care about the quality.
Right.
They need the content.
Yeah.
Now that's the sort of things that we would avoid, and with younger writers, to help younger blackfellas writing to avoid, because people will ask you to do things and not really care if you can do it well.
Yeah.
So your standards have actually got to be higher if you really want to be again, if you want to control your identity, you've got to work to the highest standard possible.
Yeah.
So it's a great challenge.
Right. Can I ask you as well then, if by sort of separating the work out, is there an implied, and I understand that there's hundreds of Indigenous languages and there's very, very diverse groups, but is there is it implied that there's a similarity in content then, or do you think that there are themes and styles of writing and things that connect Indigenous writing in Australia?
Well, it's interesting that Melissa just made a really important point. I think there are various styles. I mean, our writing is I think quite similar in style. But yeah, if you go back to Untitled himself, he's one of those classic post-colonial writers in the colonial era, where you'll hear writers in the post-colonial, say India, the Caribbean, etc. These writers often they've read the canon. Yeah, they've read all the English canon and they will utilise it as it suits their purpose. So again, you're thinking strategically. But Melissa said something really important. There was the reading of the film Beneath Clouds, or the reading of Ellen's story. What I think is the difference is that you do read a story differently and you write a story differently. So, and your point about, say, asking that question about alcohol or representation, my sense of it as a writer is different than I think than whitefella reception, and blackfellas will often read it quite differently. Right. And to talk about practitioners and narrative, when people used to say, oh, well, Aboriginal people always make films in a very particular way, sometimes I was a little sceptical of that myself. And then when I saw Beneath Clouds, which I've written essays and published on, and met Ivan, there was moments in that film where black fellas in the audience room were pissing themselves laughing, the white fellas thinking, what the fuck is going on? And other moments when Aboriginal people were really just gripped, heartbroken, and no one got that.
Right.
And I thought by the end of that film, Ivan Sen reached an Aboriginal audience as an Aboriginal filmmaker in a way that was totally inclusive, and most people outside that had no sense of what was going on.
Right. I mean, it's particular to all kinds of identity issues in writing, isn't it? I mean, I did an undergraduate degree for 4 years specifically in Scottish literature, and there'll be plenty of people who will tell you that isn't a thing that exists, you know. And I think if you read Irvin Welsh, or anybody who writes in a really strong vernacular, somebody like me reading that gets a completely different response to it than anybody else would.
I think we should be taking questions soon if
Sure.
but I just want to say one of the best things about this collection is that in all of the 4 stories, which are all, I think, you know, pretty high quality stories, there's not a single didgeridoo.
Thanks, Alyssa.
He burnt his didgeridoo, my fella.
Sorry?
He burnt his didgeridoo.
Oh, did he? Sorry. Well, even better.
So it's time for Q&A. If you would just wait for the mic so that we can hear you properly, and please feel free to address your questions to any of our 5 panellists.
As long as they're questions, that is, and not just long statements.
Thank you. While you're thinking up what you want to ask, can I ask you guys a question about collecting a set of Aboriginal Australian stories? Was there any anxiety in there for you? You're both white. You're not even Australian, Jordan.
Yeah,
Chris, I think you're not Australian either. I suppose none of us are. But was there a feeling that you were on ground that you need to tread carefully on?
Yeah.
I think I had the luxury of not feeling that too much. I mean, we put this together before I knew I would have to show up here and talk about it, which maybe was helpful. And I think it's exactly like Tony was saying. Like, I knew what my standards were going to be for these stories and for this section, and I think, I just always thought of us as doing it on those terms, and about finding the work and presenting the work, and not really trying to make a statement beyond that. I think.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I was reading the stories, I was looking at them as stories, pure and simple first, before anything else. And maybe because I didn't grow up here, I don't really have that sort of I don't have that history, you know. So I just was looking for great stories, and in fact, the whole thing wouldn't have happened if we hadn't have got great stories. And we sort of agreed that from the beginning. It doesn't. The fact that all the writers happened to be Indigenous was sort of incidental. If we didn't get 4 or 6 great stories, then it just wouldn't have happened, you know. So it was all about the stories being awesome stories that McSweeney's would be happy to print anyway, you know, and the fact that they're collected together in this little suite of stories is a good thing, because it's a nice little snapshot of the great work that Aboriginal writers are doing in the short form in Australia at the moment, which is kind of, I guess, the point of it.
But it was specifically that you were looking for Indigenous stories in order to showcase that work. Right?
Yeah, but they had to be awesome.
Right.
No one was getting a free ride, you know.
Yep, that's one on the right.
Hi, thank you. And I will be going and buying the anthology after this. So
Once a year.
Buy early and buy often.
Had a question for any of the three writers. We're talking about Icelandic as a language and it being separate to other languages, and I wondered if any of you three speak one or two Indigenous, or any of the Indigenous languages, and whether that impacts on the way that you write English in any way, whether rhythmically you think it has any impact on your writing.
I have two Aboriginal words. One's gammon, which is bullshit. One's gilla, which is toilet. And there's one for the police, which I forget.
Ellen and I are from the same broad language group, Yugambeh, in my case Yugambeh Bunjalung, and over the last 20 odd years there's been language reclamation to the point where I have simple conceptual thought in Yugambeh, and there aren't fluent Yugambeh speakers for me to converse with, that I know of anyway. But as I drive or walk or cycle through country, I speak to the country in language, and the country speaks to me. And I can take it a step further, and I can play with linguistic concepts in Yugambeh in a primitive kind of way. It's nothing like it would have been pre-white contact, but it's a hell of a lot more than I was born with, and it's hopefully will be expanded on, in future generations, I think. Ellen?
More and more I'm thinking that English is my second language, but my first language was taken from me. It kind of saddens me that I can speak fluent Dutch because my father was born and raised there, and my mother can also speak Dutch, but
Does that make it double Dutch?
But you can't speak Yugambeh, can you?
No.
Right. Was there never the option for you to learn from someone? Or?
I remember my grandmother speaking a lot of it, but she passed away when I was 13. I do know words, but I'm not fluent at all.
It's one over the back on the right.
I had a question for the editors. When you were going through the submissions, what did you discover about the sort of like characteristics, or were there any discoveries that you had about the Indigenous writing?
Yeah, I've got sort of strange feelings about that, because I've been asked that question a few times now, and I'm kind of uncomfortable with it, to be honest. This idea, and maybe Jordan has different ideas to me about this, but I didn't really see much in common in the submissions. Like I've done a few of these sort of anthologies and edited and judged short story competitions and so on, and for me, a lot of the stories I was getting from Indigenous writers, they're just vastly different from each other, and I actually couldn't really find a point of commonality between them. And then, of course, once you put these stories together, the first thing he bloody says is, "Oh, yeah, they're all nicely fit together." And maybe editorially I just look at things differently, but I couldn't really see much in common with a lot of the stories. In fact, that was the overriding thing about a lot of the stories was how different they all were, and dealing with so many different things and playing with language in so many different ways that I hadn't really seen before in submissions that I'd got for short story competitions and so on, where the language was very samey in a lot of them and the themes were very samey. It just seemed to be this sort of explosion of stuff going on in them, and that's one of the reasons why I got sort of so excited about it.
Yeah, I think that's what I noticed too. It was just a willingness to play with the language and push on it and play with detail. And I'm still noticing, just listening to these guys read right now, the way Tony's narrator has time to say calves mostly. and just little phrases like that pop up to add on to livestock or the table that's on its last legs in Melissa's story. There's just so many great sort of wry phrases like that and little bursts of specificity that just are the marks of really strong writing to me. And that I think it was so clear so quickly reading these. I didn't have to squint to see it or anything. It was just right there on the page that these stories were really good and that these writers were just expert in the way they were using the language.
I think this pushing against language and this urgency that you both talked about is not just true in Aboriginal writing today, but I think I'm thinking of Udjuru and I'm thinking of more recently Lionel Fogarty, especially in the poetry. I think it's always been there.
For sure.
Yeah. And the earlier question, if you haven't read Earth by Bruce Pascoe, in terms of how Aboriginal language affects written English, run out and buy it immediately because it'll blow your mind.
Tony, do you have any recommendations of other writers that people should be exploring?
Other blackfellow writers?
Well, yeah. And particularly in relation to the question about language.
Well, Blood by Tony Birch. No,
is that out now?
Yes. Jordan's got a copy if he wants to hold it up. But one of the things I will say something about language and something about writers is that I reckon one of the things that about and talking to Chris in particular is that the writing's not anarchic, but it's really there's a sense of freedom that you're using, and I reckon that is that it is the beg, borrow, steal way you grow up. You go to school. I had a Catholic school education, which is very rigid and very formal, and then I had the street, which is just a great banter and sort of a really sort of ripping language up. And I think one of the things that I enjoy about language is that I don't feel constrained. I'm not an experimental writer. I'm, in a sense, a realist. But I love the sound of words, and that sound of words comes from a street language. And Melissa talked before about other cultures. Is that a friend of mine who's a very well-known Melbourne poet, Pio, he said that one of the great things about post-war Melbourne is immigration, and is that everyone who grew up in the inner city of Melbourne, and this would be repeated in other cities in Australia. And it's why I'm attracted to North American fiction, where you get that inner city beat, and it's that you had what he calls an emotional connection. So if I see commonalities in writing, it's often between Aboriginal writers and writers of other ethnicities who grew up in the inner city. So there is a shared thing, and I think that comes across in writers that I really enjoy. I love the way they play with words. Writers to look at, I think if you look at the big sort of hitters in Australian writing, blackfellow writers of someone like Alexis Wright or Kim Scott, what's interesting about their work, and I know Alexis is more closely, but although I've read both of their books extensively and most of their books, is that they're dealing in a way which is both local and really dealing with the sort of big ticket issues that Melissa's talking about. So they're really important books in some ways. Not when I say difficult, with Alexis, she demands your attention as a reader, and I think all the better for that. She's a wonderfully intellectual writer, so they're major works. But my work has actually been different as I'm interested in the language and writing of Aboriginal people who never got to publish a book, and I was invited to the Wheeler Centre one night to be part of a group who read great speeches of history, and I read the letters of Aboriginal women written on the kitchen table at a reserve asking that their kids be fed, to have their kids sent back to them from an institution. And I said that night, these women never got the opportunity to publish anything, but their words are the most important words in Australian history in regard to Aboriginal people. So I would advise people, if you want to really get a sense of Aboriginal writing in English, go and do a bit of hard yards in the archives, in the state government archives, and you'll read the most poignant, beautiful narratives written by people, and women in particular, who were never even given access to education and yet found a way to command language. And I understand the intention of questions about do we have our own language, and I take the point about a second language. I think what we never forget, a great celebration and achievement, is that Indigenous people all over Australia adopted this technology called English in a written and oral form and turned it into something to the advantage of Indigenous people.
And did that before often the first wave of the frontier. So colonists arrived, Jordan, you wouldn't be aware of this, but colonists arrived in particular parts of northern and western Australia, believing that they were the first whites to ever get there, and they probably were the first whites to ever get there, and they'd hear Aboriginal people singing songs in English, singing British nursery rhymes, singing Irish ballads, because the cultural connections had carried that language through the country in advance of the whites.
No? Well, we'll leave it there then because it's almost 25 past already. Please join me in thanking so much Melissa, Tony, Ellen, Chris and Jordan.